In this part, I'm going to go ahead and look at some complications that arise with the CPI or similar price indices. And one is the idea of what we call the substitution bias. And the idea here would be something like the following. Suppose with the current price of beef and chicken, you eat 3 pounds of beef and 3 pounds of chicken per week. And then prices rise. And let's suppose the price of beef doubles and the price of chicken triples. Through ordinary CPI calculations, then, we would measure that your cost of living has gone up by 2.5 times 2.5, because you consumed equal amounts of beef and equal amounts of chicken initially, and the price of one doubled and the price of the other tripled, so the increase in your cost of living would be halfway between a doubling and a tripling. But if the price of one good rises by less than that of another, if the beef rises in price less than the chicken, then you might go ahead and eat less chicken and more beef. And in that way, the cost of living for you wouldn't rise by as much as you might otherwise think. It might only go up by a factor of 2.2 instead of a full factor of 2.5. So, to some degree, because the CPI assumes that people don't change their habits in reaction to changes in relative price, the CPI is going to treat people as dumber than they are and treat them as being more exposed to inflation than they really are. A bigger problem, and really a sort of huge conceptual problem for the CPI, is the introduction of new goods. So if you think about it, before something like a smartphone is invented, the price of getting a smartphone is effectively infinite. So, the price of having a phone that can do everything that an iPhone could do, well, back in 1995, that would have cost you billions of dollars to make that one very first smartphone, because all the research and development would have been needed to create that one very first phone. So if we're tracking changes in the cost of living over time, then things get really unclear about how we should treat the introduction of new goods. When the price of a new good falls very quickly as it's initially introduced, is it really right to say that that full price fall goes to depress our measured cost of living, or what? This sort of thing also gets tricky if you're sort of asking the question of, well, which is it better to be? Is it better to be like a super multimillionaire living 100 years ago, or someone today with a modest $30,000 or $40,000 a year in income today? And that really gets to be a tough question as to which of those people has higher economic welfare. Because, of course, people living 100 years ago didn't have penicillin, and air conditioning was virtually unknown, and air travel was unknown, and lots of things that we take fairly for granted were completely unknown. On the other hand, if you had millions of dollars, you could have a big giant mansion and servants and so on and so forth, which would also be something that the person with a more modest income but modern technology couldn't have. Last, we want to think about what's called unmeasured quality change. So we may see that a particular good has been manufactured for a long time. So let's suppose we're thinking about a Toyota Corolla. And Toyota Corollas have been made for a long time, and it hasn't really been the same car for all that time. Year by year, either in minor adjustments or major reworking of the model, things have changed. So how do we deal with the fact that, say, for instance, the car now gets somewhat better gas mileage? That one's maybe fairly easy to deal with, because we could think about how much money you save by getting to get better gas mileage, so we could correct for that. But what about something like if it has a better steering, or it has better braking than the older models? How do we actually include that in trying to think about how much a new Corolla might be better than an old Corolla? So those get to be some sticky questions. Because of all those things, the CPI may mildly overstate the inflation. Also, because of those things, there are some adjustments to the way the CPI is actually calculated that make it a fair amount more complicated than what we've laid out in this video lecture. So there's a lot of sort of sophisticated statistical modeling that goes into it and adjustments of it. And essentially, those adjustments make it a lot more complicated. They've also probably reduced the overstatement problem down to a pretty manageable level of about 0% or maybe 0.5% per year. And that's probably about as good as you're going to get. The other thing that sometimes comes up is, well, we can measure inflation using different price indices. So we saw the GDP deflator already. The GDP deflator is a price index that reflects the price of everything that's produced domestically, regardless of whether or not consumers directly care about it, or whether or not it's something that consumers even care about at all. The CPI, on the other hand, reflects the things that consumers care about, but it does so regardless of where they're produced. So you can see where both in terms of what goods are covered and where they're produced, these two different price indices analyze slightly different things. I wouldn't want to worry too much about that, though, because if we sort of look at the behavior of these two over time, as you can see in this particular chart, they really parallel each other very, very closely. So it's not something that we really need to, I think, worry too much about divergences between these two. The last part of this video segment, I'm going to come back to something I did before, and that's how do we actually measure the inflation rate from the CPI? And you can tell from the fact that I've put 2 questions on this that I think this is probably a pretty important skill for you guys to be able to handle.